part because we've got Carolina here, and it's not often to have some president of a big public corporation like this, and I think the Uruguayan experience is a, if not unique one, an important one. And we have a chapter in this book on corporatization about Uruguay as well, about the water provider. But I'll let Danielle and Carolina talk about that a bit more. I don't know why I regularly do these books that have the ugliest words in them: corporatization, remunicipalization, commodification. I mean, it's just ugly, ugly stuff. But these are really important words. And I highlight them in part because it's really important that we have a handle on what these words mean. Corporatization is not privatization. I'm going to talk about why it's perhaps dangerous, why it's potentially problematic, and more importantly, why it might be something that can be potentially progressive. So what is corporatization? Let me just describe this first. It's a term that's used to describe state-owned enterprises, and this can be in the services sector, it can be in the manufacturing sector. They are 100% owned by the state and 100% managed by public employees. There is no private sector involvement in a corporatized entity. Importantly, though, what they are is arm's length from the state. So they are legally separate entities with their own, depending on the legal structure of a country or municipality, some autonomy from its governing elected body. And you can have municipal level, provincial level, and national level corporatized entities. And it's this arm's length autonomy which distinguishes it from a public service. And it typically will hire managers who are professional people from different backgrounds. But the idea here is to give them some autonomy from the political elected officials. And they're often separated from other entities as well. And I'll get back to this question of separation, because it's both a blessing and a curse. But you'll often have a water provider and an electricity provider or a telecoms provider as separate corporatized entities, all with some autonomy from the state, but all with autonomy from each other. And it's this kind of silo effect that is really critical here. So that's the kind of institutional definition. Why is it important to study these things? In part because they are everywhere. And they are growing dramatically. In part because of the failure of the state as a sort of monopolistic single entity. There's a sense that the state hasn't been providing sort of coordinated public services, so there's a need to create these arm's length entities. But it's also because of the failures of privatization. And as we'll see, some corporatizations are intended as a kind of halfway measure to privatization. But that's not necessarily the case, although some people see corporatization as a kind of way to do privatization without actually bringing private sector in. Our book looks at electricity and water, and I would say that those are the two sectors where corporatization is most prevalent around the world. But we're seeing it in everything. Universities are being corporatized, telecoms, transportation, airports, childcare, forests, you name it. This is a massive trend around the world to create these arm's length entities. But it's also important because a lot of people see it as an alternative to privatization. And by definition, it is. It is 100% owned by the public sector, by the state. So it is not a form of privatization. However, in its most dominant form, it's kind of neoliberal corporatization, it is hugely problematic. And to be honest, after years of working on this topic here in South Africa, and I know ESCOM and Rand Water have come up a number of times, these are not the kinds of corporatized entities that we're interested in. And I had sort of written off corporatization as just another way of neoliberalizing the state. And this dominant form of new public management where you bring in managers, often with MBAs and finance backgrounds, where what they're after is improving the financial bottom line, introducing market-based performance incentives, skyrocketing salaries for senior managers to try and compete with the private sector. So over the last 30 years, parallel to the privatization trend, and I would argue even more strongly than the privatization trend, has been this trend towards corporatization. In part because what the private sector wants without the controversy of privatization. And it has allowed the state, and certainly the South African state has done this for many years, to say, no, 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 we're not privatizing. This is a publicly owned entity. Who are you to criticize us for doing this? And part of the problem here is that it creates confusion. And you look at Eskom, you look at Randwater, and other public and corporatized entities in South Africa, people aren't quite sure who to criticize, because it isn't privatization. But it has the same effect of commodifying services, of introducing a kind of morality of payment. So you have the right to water in South Africa, but you have the moral responsibility to pay for it. And moral heavyweights like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu were coming out and saying to people, you must pay for your services. If you don't pay for your water and electricity, it means the person down the road isn't going to get access to their services. So it's kind of this commodification code that has crept into the public sector around the world through this kind of corporatization format. So why bother re-examining it? Well, what we were finding with our work was that there are more progressive forms of corporatization. And it is 100% owned by the state. And there is a kind of an accountability that comes with that. And we thought, well, maybe we need to rethink and relook at this, both theoretically and, most importantly, empirically. It's one thing to think in the abstract about these things, but we want to actually hit the ground, do interviews, find out what's happening, look at financial reports, etc. And that's exactly what we did. And I'll say that through this process, my own position has changed on this, in that now I see corporatization really just as an empty institutional vessel into which all kinds of different ideological fluids can be poured. And in fact, it's a long historical model. This framework goes back to sort of the pre-Roman era. In fact, the Romans were doing it, the Persians were doing it, and more recently, it was through the medieval period, we saw it. The Swedes were starting in the 1700s, and we saw all kinds of diverse regimes. I mean, the Nazis were doing it in Germany. The Soviets introduced about 750,000 corporatized entities. The Chinese Communist government introduced over 1 million of these things. So this is a very diverse model of having arm's-length state-owned entities, obviously with very diverse trajectories and strategies and intended outcomes. So corporatization is not inherently neoliberal, and there's no reason that we should abandon it as a way of thinking about public services. But of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and if it tastes very bitter, it's not the kind of public that we're after. So what we really wanted to do was apply the kinds of performance metrics that we've been looking at in the MSP around equity and affordability and transparency and accountability, and pick some corporatized entities that seem to meet those criteria and look at them in more detail. And we're not expecting perfect public services. You'll wait for an awfully long time because they don't exist and they never will. Nothing is ever going to be perfect. But we're trying to get a sense of, well, how good are these public services? So we looked at water and electricity, as I mentioned, and we looked at water in Uruguay, mostly, in the Philippines, district level service, and in Burkina Faso. And in the electricity sector, we looked at Costa Rica, chapter that Danielle did, Tunisia, North Africa, and Malaysia. So it's a very diverse range of states. We wanted to get that kind of diversity to get a sense of what it looks like in different places. And indeed, they have very different histories. They have very different outcomes. And I won't talk at length about those things, except to make just some general comments about the 3 different regions. And these are broad brushstrokes, but I think it's safe to say that the Latin American experience is a different one in our cases in Costa Rica and Uruguay, partly because of this strength of the kind of social democratic, left-leaning social democratic trends. And as we'll hear from Carolina in a moment, I was in Uruguay a year and a half ago. There's a different kind of mentality, public ethos from these managers of these state-owned enterprises. We invited Manusi Gagaba, the current Minister of Public Enterprises, to come and speak here. We were trying to get some other people. I couldn't even get through to the telecom office to try and set up a meeting for hearing. In fact, the number order, their information number. So that's the kind of, they talk about consumer, customer engagement, but they can't even get to that right now in the neoliberal front. And this is not to say that Uruguay is perfect, but there's a different kind of way of looking at these things. And we heard earlier about the Costa Rican health system and the kind of commitment at the level of senior managers, politicians, frontline service providers. And that may be the hardest thing to think about is how you create that public ethos. And it doesn't happen overnight. You don't just introduce on paper principles of Bato Pele, as they talk about South Africa. You have to build over a long time a kind of sense of that publicness. And that certainly comes through in the Latin American context. The two cases we did in Malaysia and the Philippines were very different. Malaysia, of course, a kind of autocratic kind of history, but the state is very efficient. And the state can kind of decree things to happen. And they've decreed that they want a kind of public service provider with electricity and have rolled out services in a very effective and efficient way. Anyone who thinks the state can't be efficient only needs to look at some of these autocratic regimes. So I think the Asian case is quite mixed. As it was in Africa, in fact, the Tunisian case, there's another autocratic regime, almost 100% electricity coverage in rural and urban areas, but a regime that is now grappling with this so-called post-Arab Spring uprising, and people now demanding that the national electricity provider be accountable. So they are public, so they should be accountable, just like the state should be accountable. So there's this transition going on in Tunisia with this arm's length entity, which is really fascinating at the moment. The saddest case is Burkina Faso, and I think that's true of most of sub-Saharan Africa, where the grip of the World Bank and other international financial institutions is just so strong. And so the World Bank has been in there recognizing that the private sector isn't interested in providing water and electricity, so they're trying to corporatize these things. And so some of the managers are like, no, we want a public service, and it's celebrated as a public entity, but it's just rife with the kind of neoliberal attitudes and pressures. And these things, we saw, even in the Costa Rican and Uruguayan context, managers battling, each other about where they want to go. So this is, there's no magic formula for having a public corporatized entity. There's battles that take place at all kinds of levels, internally and externally. So looking to the future, I think it's very clear that you can have well-run, equity-oriented, efficient, accountable, transparent, corporatized entities. There's nothing inherently neoliberal about these things. But the market pressures are huge. The World Bank, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is an enormous player. We're seeing it happening in Tanzania and Uganda and other places where the World Bank's in on corporatization. But it can be done differently. But there are three things I think I'll just finish with that are inherently problematic with corporatization. And one is this creation of silos. As soon as you create a separate legal entity, it can make it difficult for the senior managers of water to talk to the electricity people, to talk to the transportation people. Sometimes they're in different parts of the city, different parts of the country, they've got their own sort of profiles to protect, etc. So you create these silos by definition with corporatization that can be hard to overcome. The second one is that it's inherently the state. And as we've been discussing so far, sometimes the state is very problematic. And their reluctance in some ways to let civil society in, to let labor in. That doesn't mean it's impossible to do with a corporatized model. But it is an inherently statist framework, which can make it difficult to think beyond the state when we're talking about the public. And thirdly, and this is, again, not inherent to corporatization, but is the kind of productivism that we've seen. We've seen it with Soviet models, we've seen it with social democratic models, we've seen it with the liberal models, where it's let's pump out as much electricity as we can. Let's pump out as much water as we can. We've got to increase consumption, etc. There's this underlying assumption that the more is better, the kind of buying into a kind of developmentalist model of consumerism. And changing that kind of mentality is also, I think, going to be a real challenge, whether it's on the left or the right, as the environmental movement. As well as we need to think carefully about this kind of thing as well. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll